Now, if you look on page 7, let's talk about how we move from an unhealthy distrust to a healthy trust in relationship. And the first thing there is just simply recognize the ways you use indirect means to communicate with your spouse. Recognize them. Do you do these things? Take some time and say, do I manipulate? Do I control? Am I detached? What do I tend to do in how we relate together? It might even be something good to share with one another. The second thing is to identify the areas of your relationship that cause you to connect in indirect ways with your spouse. So what are the things that cause you to do that? Is it because your spouse shuts you down all the time? Is it because you're just afraid of how your spouse is going to react? Is it because, in the past you've been burnt, so you've learned that I've got to control everything? What is it? Identify what those things are that cause you to connect with one another in these indirect ways and talk about them. If you don't share, if you don't talk about them, your spouse will never understand. If your spouse doesn't understand, you can't have that closeness. Number 3, talk together about ways you can develop healthy trust and connection in your relationship together. So there's some suggestions there. Set aside some time to talk about these ways you communicate indirectly. Share some things that get in the way of open communication in your relationship. You might even want to develop a plan for, hey, why don't we just spend some date nights going out and just exploring one another? And maybe this time we're going to talk about our history, or we'll talk about our interests or our backgrounds. It makes a great opportunity to have conversations about these things. And then finally, set aside regular time to communicate openly together. You've got to set aside time to communicate together. Like I said, I've done surveys of the church. I usually do one every year. Every year, I've done 2 of them so far, and both of them, like I said, next to communication, the number one issue is time. Number one issue in our church area here is time. And that's because we do not set aside time for one another. We set aside time for everything else in our lifestyle, but then we only catch up with one another in the gaps. We need to set aside time to communicate because it just doesn't happen in the 5 minutes when you're rushing from one thing to the other. All right?